Kia ora, good evening. Former Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters has been trespassed from Parliament for 2 years. The order came from Speaker Trevor Mallard after Mr Peters attended the 23-day occupation on Parliament's grounds in February. Well, Mr Peters joins me now. Mr Peters, you've been deemed a security risk, a trespasser. What did you think when you opened that envelope?
Well, I thought it was a hoax or a joke. I couldn't believe it, and I wanted to make sure that I hadn't been sort of set up, so to speak. But then I found out that it was actually true, and having made inquiries and taken legal advice, I come to the conclusion that it's unlawful, it's unreasonable, and it cannot stand.
Does the trespass notice give any grounds for your ban, Mr Peters?
No, it recites the legislation of the Trespass Act 1980, and I was in Parliament when that law was passed, and also the 2000 legislation about the precincts of Parliament. But it overlooks the serious case of 1999, the Beggs case, in which there were members of the current Parliament involved. The finding was in their favour about Parliament being a place where people could protest.
And so you think that's a precedent because you weren't trespassing there, you weren't protesting with the people who had been asked to leave, you were there in your capacity as a former Member of Parliament. Is that the distinction?
Well, the reality is that people had all their reasons to be there, but I was asked by the protesters to come and speak to them. And you remember at the time, every other member of the present Parliament had said that they wouldn't talk to them. They'd agreed that they would boycott any conversation with them. And I couldn't believe it, and I believed that it was my duty to hear both sides of the story. But to see this blunderbuss of an act by the Speaker is something that no New Zealander should put up with, and I certainly do not intend to.
Because you weren't there protesting, were you, Mr Peters? You hadn't joined the protest. You were there for a walkabout in a sort of semi-official capacity.
No, I went there because they asked me, and there were thousands of requests for me to turn up and speak to them. And so I did. I thought somebody should hear them out. You don't have to agree with people, but then later on, days and weeks later, it deteriorated into violence and criminal behaviour. That's something else. But I'm talking about the legitimate people who are making a legitimate protest.
Is it at the discretion of the Speaker here, Mr Peters?
Well, he's got a discretion, but it's not absolute. He himself is not above the law. And when he said just not so long ago that my powers are sort of absolute, it demonstrates that he doesn't understand what his role is. He is the servant of Parliament, and Parliament lays down the rules here. And I'm calling upon the present parliamentarians to have a good hard look at what's going on now.
Well, there wasn't a lot of support forthcoming from your former parliamentary colleagues today when they met at the Parliamentary Security Committee. Only ACT was in support of an exemption for former MPs from those trespass orders. So it doesn't look promising there, Mr Peters.
Well, I think you've entirely misread what you've just seen. Now, with respect, you have utterly misread what you've just seen. But wait a few days and you'll find out what this means. New Zealanders are not going to put up with this sort of dictatorial, absolutist behaviour.
So you believe that you do have the support of other parliamentary parties in the Parliament on this matter, aside from ACT?
Well, if they've got no idea what they're there for, then I won't have their support. If they understand now, and I'm certain that their advisors are saying, for goodness sake, wake up, this is a very bad situation, said in your name, although he's your servant, not your master, which is the distinction, then they will do what is right.
Well, what happens next, Mr Peters?
Well, as I said, I'm taking legal advice. I'm hardly past 24 hours since I've received this outrage, so to speak, and worked out that it actually is, on his part, the Speaker's part, serious. It is duck shooting season, and it's the first week of it, and stand back and watch.
It must make you want to get back in there, Mr Peters. Thank you so much for joining us here on 8 o'clock.